Hey guys, what's going on? What's up? What's happening? Is science fiction a fantasy genre? Is sci-fi and fantasy the same kind of thing? Is it really the same story? Like fantasy is fantasy of the past and sci-fi is fantasy of the future. But there's really two kinds of sci-fi. There's sci-fi fantasy, which is like sci-fantasy or science fantasy, or there's also science fiction, which is completely different. And science fiction is more of like, it's more of a fiction story, but technologically driven, like in the future or on some other planet or something where it's explained by science, where everything is explained by science. It's explained by the laws of physics. It's explained by inventions and gadgets that make things happen. And even though it's made up stories about the future, it's based on science and technology driven, that explain the things that happen in that story that makes it different than a current reality fiction story. Whereas science fantasy is a story about the future or a sci-fi story, but it has to do with fantasy. So, like, for example, there are a lot of stories that are just fantasy and science fiction, where the character in the book lives in two different worlds. They live in a sci-fi world and a fantasy world. In Split Infinity and Blue Adept, the Apprentice Adept series by Piers Anthony, in those books, basically, he's got, the main character starts off living in a futuristic sci-fi science-driven world, and he transfers over, he walks through some kind of portal or doorway or something where he's in a complete fantasy world where not only does magic work, but science doesn't work. Like, there are no inventions, there are no science inventions, everything works by magic, nothing works by science. The laws of science don't apply, and that is a combination of sci-fi and fantasy. But then there's like science fantasy, basically. Like, if you look at the story The Fifth Element, in The Fifth Element, that's based on the story The Fifth Element, it's a science fantasy story. It's got either sci-fi, where he's got spaceships, it's the future, it's flying cars, it's gadgets, it's, laser weapons, it's got like spaceships and stuff like that. And everything is like futuristic and everything is very technological, but a lot of the story is, kind of like mysterious forces at work in the universe. There's the rocks, the stones, where, it's not really clear how they work. One of them is fire, one of them is air, one of them is water, one of them is earth, or whatever it is. And when you put them all together, they send this beam into space and avert the incoming whatever that thing was that was going to destroy everything, and got rid of it. And it doesn't explain how it did that technologically. It explains it as, no, it's just these stones, and you put them the right way and you activate them, they will get rid of that big thing that was attacking the planet Earth, right? In the movie. But if you look at a different movie like Dune, that's a huge movie, and it's also the book, it's just the story Dune, right? If you look at that, it's completely science fiction. There is no fantasy at all. It's not fantasy at all, and even the things that are fantasy kind of based are science fiction explained. But if it's explained by science, it's not fantasy. Fantasy is basically a world where the things in the world are explained by magic. Like the dragon breathes fire. Well, how does the dragon breathe fire? Well, through magic. Or there might be some kind of like contraption of why they breathe fire, but how can a dragon breathe fire? It just doesn't exist in the world. It doesn't sound like even something that could exist like in the laws of physics, because the fire would be too hot, unless the dragon was used to that kind. I mean, it depends what the dragon was made of. Maybe it was made of some kind of material that wasn't flesh. But if the dragon was made of like regular flesh or any life form on Earth is made of, it wouldn't be able to breathe fire, because fire is just too hot, and the fire would be too hot for it to breathe and kind of burn itself if it actually tried to breathe fire. even if there's a contraption, even if it's got like a gland that spits out, acid, and then another gland where it creates a spark, maybe through flint and steel or some kind of material, it doesn't matter because the temperature of fire is too hot for any flesh to withstand. It would just burn itself, right? If anyone tried to breathe fire, it would burn itself. Like those people that breathe fire as circus tricks, they basically, so the danger is that they can burn themselves with the fire that they're breathing, So the people that spit fire, they gotta be really careful. They can't actually touch it, and it's only like a circus trick. That's the only way to actually like breathe fire or spit fire or anything like that. So it doesn't make sense. There's just no way to explain it with science. So if you look at the story Dune, it explains the things in the story through science. And even though the story is very, very mysterious, and a lot of the concepts in it are mysterious, those concepts are explained through science. Like they talk about clairvoyance, they talk about lots of like the Bene Gesserit witches who can pretty much like command people to do things using the voice and whatever, or well, the voice is, that's actually a little bit fantasy because they don't really, I don't know, they probably explained it. I just haven't, I'm not like that into Dune, but the thing about the voice was, even though it's a fantasy concept, they explained how the Bene Gesserit witches were able to do the voice through science. They didn't just say, oh, they just had magical powers and they could do it, just like wizards. It's like, how did the wizard, make the light turn on? Well, it was magic. Instead of like, no, he had a light bulb and that's how it works, and in electricity, or in the future there's some kind of technology that does it. If you look at even the clairvoyance in Dune is not clairvoyance which occurs magically. The clairvoyance in Dune occurs through ingesting the spice melange. So basically it's a substance which interacts with people to give them clairvoyance. And I guess some people could say, well, clairvoyance isn't possible in any other way than magic, but we really don't know what's possible, and that's where science fiction kind of is able to really open up and create a lot of story there, because we don't know what's possible. There could be a substance in the future that creates clairvoyance in people. There could be Bene Gesserit religions where the people are they're taught how to use their voice to command people to do certain things. It's basically, it's mysterious, but they kind of like the voice. I'm not sure about that. I think that's a little bit that sounds like a little bit mysterious, because that sounds a little bit like you can't really explain it with science. But the thing is, you can't explain it with modern science, but Dune is 10,000 years in the future. And what's possible 10,000 years in the future through technology or through other things that get created that's not exactly technology, but they're innovations that happen to people in the future. Like there's just no, if they explain it well, these witches are they have this self-discipline, and they learn from, and they were like genetically engineering each other so that they would become more powerful. And it's just they bring so much unknown science into Dune, where it's really, really hard to tell that, is this a science fiction or a science fantasy? Because you could just call it a science fiction, because it's 10,000 years in the future, that wouldn't explain, it's just like, you don't really have to explain everything that happens in that story, because, what's possible, we don't know what's possible in 10,000 years, it could not have anything to do with magic. It could have to do with, some kind of innovation, some kind of technology, some kind of learned discipline, some kind of thing that people become aware of that they didn't know about in the past, you know? So that's the thing about that. And there's a little bit of fantasy in it, but what explains the fantasy is that no, it's just 10,000 years in the future and things are different. And also, I think partly when you put something where there's like substances like the spice melange, which causes clairvoyance and causes like people to see the future and whatever, you know, once there's that element in the future, you can do things like the Bene Gesserit witch's voice that commands people to do stuff, and you could explain it, you know, in some other substance that allows them to do that or whatever it is, you know, because you don't know what's possible in the future. That's where you can kind of get a little bit fantasy, where, you know, just because we understand like the future science in 10,000 years, we do not understand it. Like if we saw a let's just say like in 10,000 years there's different kinds of machines and different kinds of technology than we have now. If we saw that technology, like a machine from 10,000 years in the future, we might not even recognize it as a machine. We might not know what it is. We might, like, it might look like the obelisk from 2001, where it's mysterious, we don't know how it works, we don't know anything about it. It doesn't look like anything we recognize, you know? It's just the same thing where, you know, like 10,000 years in the past, the technology was Stone Age. It was like people were pretty much, you know, like hammering, you know, they were taking like rocks and tying them onto sticks. And there was just a lot of like whatever technology there was just like made of things that was just lying around. You know, they would pick up like rocks and they would sharpen them and make knives out of them. They would try to make clothes out of natural substances. They would make fire. You know, it wouldn't be, there was no television set. There was no computer. If they saw a computer, you know, 10,000 years ago, or a TV set that was a working TV set, they wouldn't recognize it. They wouldn't even know that it's technology from the future because it's so weird. It would be so different than anything else they've ever seen, that they wouldn't see the lineage. It wouldn't connect, you know what I mean? So that's kind of like, they might, unless it's explained, unless someone walks up to them and says, this is technology from the future, and then they'd be like, oh, okay, I understand now. Oh, okay, fine. I see what you mean. You know, they would understand because they're still people and they have the same, you know, they have the same intelligence we have now. So if somebody like took technology from the future and showed it to us and explained it, oh, this is technology from the future, it'd be like, oh, wow, that's amazing. You know, but if it was just randomly there, we wouldn't even know what the hell it was. Like, we wouldn't know it was technology from the future, you know? And so when you have just science, when you have just, like just technology, just spaceships, aliens, you know, science, laser guns, interstellar travel, like you can travel faster than light speed or something like that. You could travel instantaneously from place to place, but it's explained with science, you know. And it's just like, you know, for example, you could have a movie where there's a lot of science fiction, where there's spaceships and everything. But then when you have a concept like the Force, you know, which is a fantasy concept, it's not a scientific concept, you know, as far as we know. So unless they didn't explain, you know, in the movies, they didn't explain the Force in a scientific way. They explained it as a mysterious thing that you kind of learn about and learn to use and learn and kind of like interact with, and they don't really tell you how it works. They don't really know how it works. It's mysterious. It's the Force, whatever it is. So whenever you have anything, you know, so you could say kind of like, you know, so you could say like science is sort of, you know, science fiction as long as it's explained by, you know, like by science. Like you could say kind of like science is sci-fi technology is sci-fi, religion is, or religion or beliefs or any kind of powers or anything where it's not really explained well is fantasy. Fantasy is the things in the universe we don't understand. We don't understand them to the degree that we don't grasp it. Like, we don't know how it works, and that's what makes it fantasy. It's like, we just don't know how it works. Because it works, you have it, it's there. But because you don't know how it works, it's fantasy. Like, for example, a lot of modern technology, we understand how some of it works, and it's explained by science, right? But then other parts are like, oh, we kind of don't understand how that works. Like, we don't really understand how luck works, like the concept of luck, people, we don't know why sometimes things work out and sometimes they don't, right? It's just luck. It's a lot of it is luck. You can't explain it by science. You can't say, if I do this exact thing, it's going to work out, because it does or it doesn't, but if you, with machines and technology, that if you put these materials together, like, these parts of a cell phone together, they will have a working cell phone every single time. If you put this car together, there will be a car every single time, and you don't know that in other parts and in other things. You just don't know that, because you can do something like pretty much, if you cook a recipe a certain way, it will pretty much taste that way every single time, and that's science, right? But then there's the mysterious. There's like what we can't explain, things that happen that we don't understand, and those things are like the concept of, you can do something and sometimes it works, and then you can do something and sometimes it doesn't. And so that's more of a science fantasy kind of like genre. And what's interesting about it is it's that fantasy is only science that's not under, like, if it was explained, if it was able to be explained, it wouldn't be fantasy, wouldn't be magic, it would be science. So what's interesting is with fantasy, wizards and it's not just wizards and magic, it's also, worlds of the past, it's also creatures of the past, dragons, mythological creatures that might have lived and might not have lived, unicorns, Pegasuses, whatever, creatures that were in mythological stories, centaurs, minotaurs, cyclopses, giants, right? All of these things were talked about and not explained. And what's interesting is that a fantasy story, it makes us think about the things that are not explained, the things that we don't understand, the things that work, but we don't really know how they work. Whereas science fiction kind of like gives us the kind of story where in the future, technology is going to make the world a better place. And I think technology will make the world a better place. I think at some point we will have, video games that are identical to, you wouldn't even know you were in a video game. It would be a simulation, sort of like the Matrix, where you feel like you're completely immersed in it, and it feels completely real, but it's a video game, so nothing like bad can happen. Like, you can pretty much, whatever happens, it's just a video game. You can just kind of turn it on and turn it off, and you can kind of be in it or you're not in it. It just doesn't have any effect over reality. Spaceships that go very, very quickly, people living all over the galaxy, other alien life forms that we encounter, and also machines that pretty much take care of everything, machines that do all the work. Like, eventually machines are going to get to the point where they're going to do all the work, to the point where people don't have to do any work. Machines will maintain themselves, and do all the work. They'll create food, they'll create things, they will just make stuff up. They will just make stuff. Whatever it is, we will just go, hey, make me a souffle, and then it'll make you a souffle in like 5 minutes, or even in a minute. You know, it's just, machines are gonna get to the point where people seriously will not be able to do any work, even if they want to. Like, I mean, like, if they want to do work, they can, but they won't have to because everything will be automatic. And that's not that far in the future. I'm thinking less than 100 years. You know, it could even be that way in 20, 30 years. I don't even know. Or it's just getting closer and closer and closer and closer to that, until at some point it'll just be like 100%, you know, mechanized. All the work is mechanized, you know? So it'll change everything. But the thing is that there's that, you know, that there's the idea that in the future things are going to be great. People will do work that means something, not that is just kind of like sweat equity. Like they're gonna do work that means something for people, you know, rather than work that's necessary for survival, right? Because machines will do all that. And it's just interesting about, you know, stories about what things will look like in the future, like, you know, traveling through space, talking to aliens and stuff like that. And it's not that, and this is the thing that sci-fi has in common with fantasy. It affects it's our imagination. It's like fantasy talks about the stuff that's mysterious. The fantasy talks about the stuff we don't understand. Fantasy talks about the stuff that works, but we don't know how it works, and doesn't always work. It doesn't, you know, sometimes works. And the mysterious things of the past, were there wizards, were there mages, you know, were there barbarians and wizard and fighters, and, you know, magical items and things like that, quests and stuff like that. You know, was the past interesting? Was the past a lot different? Because there was a lot more mystery in the past than there is today because of science. There was a lot less science in the past. They looked at the sky and they saw a bunch of you know, like lights. They didn't know what that was, and then it was only through telescopes that people were like, oh, those are other worlds. And they didn't even guess those are other. There were no stories in the past saying the stars were other worlds, because it was so far of a concept, far out of a concept, that no one even could have possibly even thought that up. Because, you know, even though they made up a lot of stories about the beginning of the reality and the beginning of the world and the beginning of the universe and everything like that, and how the universe was created, and there was very, very like elaborate, very interesting stories about how things were created and stuff like that, but there were no stories about, oh, the stars are other worlds, because that's even like too far-fetched. It's like, no, they don't look like other worlds, they just look like little lights in the sky. Right? To say that they're other worlds, people would be like, that's ridiculous. How can you even say they're other worlds? They don't look like other worlds. They just look like lights in the sky, you know? And so, that was just an interesting, it was a time where there was no science, and everything was explained by magic, and everything was based on very, very heavily about belief. And science was like, you know, science came over and says, no, a lot of stuff is just, you know, things that the concepts that we understand or don't understand, they can all be explained. And, you know, and we know a little bit, we don't know everything, we know something, but they can all be explained. So it's basically, if you have a science fiction world, which is in the future, but also has magic, also has the Force or something like that, or also has things that are not explained, like elements of fantasy in it that cannot be, like things that cannot be explained, like weird powers, weird concepts, whatever, things that are not explained by science. It's science fantasy. It's just fantasy in the future, because fantasy can be in the present, the past, or the future. Whereas science fiction is in the future, and it's only based on, this is the world in the future, and based on the technology that's going to be in the future. It's always technology based, or it's also like government ideas and you know, civilization, how that would look like in the future. But basically it's like, what will happen to people through technological advancements in hundreds of years or thousands of years. And that's kind of like the whole concept of all of science fiction. You know, the question of what will happen to mankind and people in the future. In 200 years, what will the world look like? In 2,000 years, what will the world look like, you know? And fantasy is just like, in the past, because we can't go there either, what did that world look like? And they can just go all out and say, well, there was magic and there was all this other stuff that, you know, because no one can go back there and say, yes, it was, or no, it wasn't, because you can just talk about it and it becomes a whole nother thing. So yeah, let me know what you guys are thinking about this in the comments. And thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in another video later.